I'm on the faculty here at Brooklyn Law School, for those of you who don't know me. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the first in a series of events that are going to be exploring the legal, the political, the social, the economic, the moral consequences of current issues. We will have a mailing list sign up at the door as you leave, so that if you would like to stay informed about future events and about future activities and stay involved in these issues that affect all of us as citizens, both of the Brooklyn Law School community and of the United States, and indeed of the world, please, we encourage you to sign up on that list. It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight our two speakers, Michael Ratner and Lord Roger Norman, who will discuss the legal, social, human rights perspectives of U.S. military action against Iraq. And I'll tell you a little bit about them in a minute. But I'd like to start with a few personal remarks that link up with the importance, I think, of being here tonight and of the political issues that we're going to talk about. I'd like to talk a little bit about Senator Wellstone, who died in an airplane crash on Friday, who, as most of you know, was a very energetic, activist, populist U.S. senator. Paul grew up in the same block that I did, in Arlington, Virginia. He wasn't from Minnesota, and I wasn't from Brooklyn. We're both transplants. He was my brother's best friend. He spent hours in our house trying to prove to us that he was taller than my brother. My brother is only 5'6", but Paul is shorter than that. Our families were very, very close, and because of that, I can tell you about the Brooklyn Heights connection. Paul's parents met in Brooklyn Heights on Cranberry Street. That's where his mother, Minnie, was living with her sister. And that's where his father, Leon, came. Near the end of his long odyssey, Leon's family had been pushed out of Moscow and pushed from there to Siberia. And from there they went to Shanghai. And from there, finally got to Seattle. And from there to New York. And ultimately settled outside Washington, D.C., where Paul grew up. And one of the important things I want to say is that Paul was this totally apolitical guy in high school and college. He was obsessed with three things: proving that he was taller than my brother, winning the state championships in his weight category in wrestling, which he did, and marrying his high school girlfriend, and more importantly, convincing their parents to let them get married when they were only sophomores in college, which they did. His parents had a very tough time making ends meet. And the reason Paul went to college at the University of North Carolina was because he got a full wrestling scholarship there. He got very interested in political science, but he still wasn't an activist. It was only after he got his PhD and he went to Carleton College that he began getting involved in the community. First the community at Carleton, and then the community beyond that, Northfield, Minnesota, Minneapolis, and ultimately the state. He became not only an activist, but a passionate speaker who was animated by notions of both compassion and justice. He was also animated by patriotism. He was the child of immigrants, and immigrants who loved this country, as sometimes I think only those who come from countries where they're not allowed to speak their minds and disagree with the government can love this country. And he loved speaking his mind. And he didn't mind disagreeing with people. And he thought it was very important to stick by his principles. And as many of you know, he was the only U.S. senator in a close race who voted against authorizing the president power to use, at this point, military force in Iraq. So I wanted to talk about Paul tonight because it connects with our topic, looking at Iraq and examining it from notions of justice and law and compassion. But I also want to tell you about him because I think he connects with all of you and with me, with all of us. Because this is a person whose journey was from being apolitical to being involved. And this was a person whose journey was from being relatively poor, the son of immigrants, being a U.S. senator, where what he did could make a difference. And where speaking was the tool of his trade. So I think it can make a difference for all of us to become involved, to become educated, to keep learning, to keep debating, to disagree, but to have an atmosphere and to be committed to continuing to be involved, both within this Brooklyn Law School community and within the larger community. So when I got a call on Saturday from Senator Wellstone's office telling me the details of the memorial service, I had to smile. It was planned for this evening. And I knew that there would be no better memorial for Paul than for me to be here moderating this discussion and encouraging people to be involved, to be educated, and to make a difference. So with great pleasure, I want to launch our series of events by introducing to you our two very respected and extremely well-informed speakers. The format is they're going to speak for roughly 20, 25 minutes, maybe 15, but they're each going to speak, and then we're going to throw the floor open to discussion with the audience, to comments, to questions, to disagreements, to debate. Roger Norman has agreed to speak first, and he is the director of the Center for Economic and Social Rights, which is an international human rights group that focuses on poverty and economic exploitation. He's overseen and continues to oversee many projects, some in the Middle East, some in Afghanistan, and maybe most importantly for us tonight, he led the Harvard study team mission to Iraq in 1991 to investigate the consequences of actions in Iraq. So he comes to us with a wealth of knowledge about Iraq, and he can't possibly tell us all that he thinks, but he's going to start by explaining some of the context and some of the perspective based on his experience. After him, we'll hear from Michael Ratner, who is the president of the Center for Constitutional Rights. He is currently the Skelly Wright Fellow at Yale Law School, and he also teaches at Columbia Law School, from which he graduated. He has done amazingly interesting things in his career also. I'll just mention a few. He was special counsel to President Aristide in Haiti, concerned with prosecuting human rights crimes. He has litigated numerous landmark human rights cases under the Alien Tort Claims Act and the Torture Victim Protection Act. And maybe tonight, of most interest to us, is that he has litigated numerous cases looking at the illegal use of force. And both our speakers are going to shed some light on this very important issue we're looking at tonight, the consequences of military intervention in Iraq. Without further ado, I'm going to hand the podium over to Roger Norman.
I want to say thank you for that introduction and for the invitation that I got from, I should name the organization, but I'm not sure, but I'm sure we'll hear which student organization it was, and I do mean it to say thank you. And I think it was good that we had that introduction about Paul Wellstone. Almost as a reminder, I think in times like these, it's easy to think that there really is no principles and no integrity whatsoever in the U.S. government. And I think that his example shows that it is still possible. It's not easy, and it takes a lot of persistence and courage and principles to be the one or two people voting against what I think, from an objective point of view, is lunacy. And I want to try and demonstrate that. But so I think it was a good introduction for this topic here. I think I'm going to start. I want to do a few things. It's in a short time. There is a lot of information, so I'm going to compress this stuff quite a bit. But I want to start talking a little about what happened in the first Gulf War and what are some of the lessons that therefore we might expect to happen in this war. Then talk a little about what seems to be the agenda of the Pentagon, which is one of the leaders here in what we're being promised, which is endless war. And then think a little about the other side, the adversary, Al-Qaeda, and what seems to be their agenda in trying to deliver us into endless war. Talk a little about the Middle East, because that clearly is the region of critical significance for all of this. And then talk a little about where this, so far, this early stage of endless war, how does it look for Americans and for the rest of the world, both abroad and at home? And then try to briefly talk a little about human rights as a potential alternative. I would say is really the most important alternative to the endless war scenario. And luckily, because Michael is going to be talking about international law, I'm really not going to talk much about that. I'll skip over that and give more of this political background that I'm suggesting. So, the first Gulf War. I think I just want to start just with a few of the well-publicized and well-acknowledged lies that the American people were told in order to justify that war. There were a number of them, and I'm really just going to do a few of them, and this is not conspiracy theory stuff. This is all in the public domain, and I'm going to be citing a bit from quite a recent article in the Christian Science Monitor that I can tell people where it is. But so one of them was, I don't know if people remember this back then, a lot of us were probably glued to our televisions. There was, after the invasion of Kuwait, there was a huge Iraqi troop buildup on Saudi Arabia, and they were about to go over and take over, the next biggest oil fields. That was clearly, explicitly the excuse. And it was intelligence. We were told it was intelligence. So at the time, a newspaper obtained satellite information from, I think it was Soviet commercial satellite, but directly over the disputed area and showed it to military experts, clear view, who didn't see any Iraqi military buildup on the border at all. And that was then kind of justified later. It was front page news that there was this Iraqi buildup on the border, and then it kind of came out on page 30 of papers 6 months after that. After all, there wasn't. One issue. Second, that's the location of the troops, and therefore the intention. The invasion of Kuwait happened, right? But I'm talking about the pretext for turning Operation Desert Shield into Desert Storm. We were shielding Saudi Arabia, and then we had to storm them, for this reason. And then there were. That's not the only reason. The number of troops. I don't know if people remember all of the graphs on CNN, etc., about it's the fourth largest army in the world. The Iraqi army was built up a great deal. We were told there were at least 500,000, some said 700,000 troops in Kuwait occupying, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it turned out, again, subsequently it was confirmed that the number of Iraqi divisions there totaled at full strength 183,000 men. And people remember the amount of U.S. soldiers that were mobilized along with others to attack this force. 183,000, of which many of them, and it can't be estimated how many, but many fled or deserted any chance they got during and even before the American air war, so who knows how many, maybe 100,000. These were basically cannon fodder. These were not the elite troops at all. All the elite troops were back. It was mostly Shiite conscripts who were not that sympathetic to the regime of Saddam Hussein, and he just put them out there to get killed, which is what happened to very many of them that got killed if they didn't escape. So that was the force. Also, it was a modern war, we were told. There was a lot of images of first of all, the whole way the media itself was institutionally manipulated is important to keep in mind. This is the first war in which reporters were part of a pool system. So they had zero independent access to information. If you saw an image on TV, it was given to them by the Pentagon. So there were images that we saw all the time of precision-guided bombs attacking their targets, destroying them. We saw this on CNN. We were given the impression that this was a war of precision-guided munitions, when it turned out that I think 8% of the total munitions drop were precision-guided. We were told that the Patriots were incredibly effective, et cetera, et cetera. And then an MIT professor did a study, which was later confirmed by the Pentagon, that I think they all missed, or maybe one hit out of the 30. But essentially, the system did not work. I don't know if people also remember the lie that's most relevant here on human rights, which is the incubator baby story of the Iraqi troops storming a Kuwaiti hospital and ripping all the babies out of their incubators and leaving them to die on the floor. That was actually, that made its way to an Amnesty International report, unfortunately, and was specifically cited by Bush and by a whole range of U.S. officials as part of the, and of course, this is a regime that is brutally repressive, and you could stick to the facts if you didn't want to manipulate people, but there was a need to manipulate the American people at the time, and therefore we were given this story. In fact, Tom Lantos, who's the head of the Congressional Human Rights Caucus, let's keep that in mind, Human Rights Caucus, invited this speaker in who gave a tearful eyewitness account of a 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl, later to be revealed as the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to Washington, who was not in Kuwait at the time, who had been coached by Helen Knowlton, which is a PR firm, which had gotten $10 million from the Kuwaiti government to help sell the war, et cetera, et cetera. So, and of course, it was all retracted. Amnesty retracted, it was a mistake, et cetera, et cetera. This Tom Lantos, by the way, is someone who's recently quoted in the Israeli paper Haaretz as telling a visiting delegation of Israeli MPs, some of whom were labor or left-leaning MPs, who were very worried about what's going to happen in the region during and after this war with Iraq. One of the MPs, she reported anyway, that Tom Lantos said, "Don't worry, we're going to get our friendly dictator in after Saddam, so you have nothing to worry about in Israel." This was his line. So that's our Congressional Human Rights Caucus. So now, I was part of a team that went to Iraq right after the war, and the purpose was to try and actually find out what happened, do a real humanitarian assessment. And so on our second trip, the first time we went just after the war, 1 month after it ended, second time 8 months after. And I just want to paint a very quick picture that what happened is it was a massive military attack, air campaign, that destroyed the full range of infrastructure of Iraq. So it's true that civilians were not targeted per se. I didn't see any examples of civilians being targeted per se. The electricity, the sanitation system was targeted per se. All factories, all food storage, anything of value to the infrastructure was targeted. The immediate and obvious and foreseeable result was an economic collapse in the country, which had already been started by sanctions, and a public health disaster. Because suddenly, a very modern country, which Iraq was, where 90%, 95% of the people had access to clean drinking water through a piped system like we have, had sewage going through their pipes, dirty water, children getting sick. When children drink this kind of water, you get diarrhea. When you have sanctions, you don't have medicines, or it's very expensive on the black market, and you're poor, you can't do anything, and so your children die. This is exactly what happened. And again, apparently foreseeable, well, I would say certainly foreseeable, but there were actually a researcher, a professor at George Washington University, uncovered a document, a Defense Intelligence Agency document assessment of what the impact would be beforehand of attacking electricity and water, assuming there would be epidemic diseases. That was explicitly talked about. Also, it was explicitly talked about again in the Washington Post, New York Times. War planners said one of the aims of attacking this infrastructure was economic, that afterwards Iraq would have to ask U.S. and Western support to rebuild. That would be enormous leverage. Now, that's bad enough, I think, had it actually turned out that way, that there was leverage used to rebuild. But as we all know, it's been 12 years of sanctions since then. And so now, when we went and did our survey, we did a population-based epidemiological survey, we found that within the first year, 70,000 excess deaths among children under the age of 5, within 1 year after the war. UNICEF subsequently did a survey in 1999 that found that over 500,000 excess child deaths under the age of 5 between 91 and 98. UNICEF is not a radical organization. In fact, we've had a lot of dealings with them, and a lot of the information, that on-the-ground information, tends to get suppressed as it goes from the field to the head office there to headquarters in New York and then into the American media. This is why 2 of the last 3 UN humanitarian coordinators resigned in protest over sanctions. And again, these are career diplomats. Dennis Halliday was an Undersecretary General with the UN for 40 years, a respected Irish diplomat. Hans von Sponek was a 36-year German diplomat, veteran of the UN. They quit because what they saw was immoral, in their words, illegal, the destruction of a society through sanctions. So that's what we had leading up. Now, let me talk about what the explicit, open, public aims, it seems, of our government are. I'm not going to give my kind of conspiracy theory speculation. First of all, how did we get here? So, I mean, September 11th, obviously, but if we recall, not too long ago, President Bush won the election here with 49.8% of the popular vote. He won on a platform of compassionate conservatism. I mean, I don't know if people remember this far back, a year and a half or whatever it was, but there was a lot of talk of reaching out to the middle. It was a bitterly contested elections, all of this. What actually happened instead is that he put into place in the key security apparatus of the United States, Pentagon, state, except for Colin Powell, people around him, and he is the dove now in the U.S. government, Justice with Ashcroft, the UN with Negroponte, people who are the extreme right of the Republican Party. They were not mainstream Republicans, this group of people. This group of people has had a long association with each other for 20 years. They were known as the revolutionaries under Reagan. It was the young guard under Reagan who thought things should be pushed much farther, and who since have worked together in defense industry or in conservative think tanks. Some of them, like Richard Pearl, still do. Others, like Wolfowitz, Feit, Bolton, all of these people have, now work under Rumsfeld, and Cheney. So this is who is leading us in terms of policy. Their agenda, as one would imagine, is very radical and very open. Let's look at a couple of the policy papers. And I think the interesting thing about this administration and this Pentagon is that everything is quite public and explicit. They're telling us what they're going to do, essentially. So, especially under Wolfowitz, there's this proliferation of policy papers and policy briefs and bringing outside groups in to brief them and this and that. Here are a couple of the initiatives that we know about. Who knows what we don't know about? We know that there was an attempt to publicly float the notion of an Office of Strategic Information. This was an explicit office within the Pentagon that would propagate disinformation. It was a propaganda arm explicitly that would engage in what was called white and black propaganda, widely reported. There was such an outcry over it that it was publicly withdrawn by Rumsfeld. Right? So what does that mean? We have a government that we know lied to us explicitly previously, now run by these radicals who tell us we're going to create an office that's going to lie to the world. Doesn't go very well in public opinion. No, we're going to withdraw. We're really not going to do that. Clearly, the intention is to create total uncertainty as to what is true and what is not true. We don't know, and it's very hard to know what's actually happening. I just think that's true as a matter of fact right now. Another thing you may have seen is they recently have established a new intelligence office. Why did they establish, and all of this is New York Times, Washington Post, why did they establish a new intelligence office? Because they didn't like the intelligence they were getting from the CIA. Because the CIA was not linking al-Qaeda with Iraq sufficiently for Rumsfeld and his group of people who inherently believe this, that if this doesn't exist, they will create an intelligence office that will reanalyze the information such that it does exist. And it should also be noted that already we tend to look at intelligence agencies as the CIA or FBI. In fact, 80% of the U.S. intelligence budget is already under the Pentagon, DIA and NSA and things of this nature. So, so we have the new intelligence agency. We have a new nuclear doctrine. I don't know how many people read about this, but it's called unilateral strike doctrine. Right? The old doctrine was mutually assured deterrence, etc., Soviet Union. The new doctrine is we explicitly reserve the right to strike first in a number of scenarios, which are all listed. but they listed 3 general categories. Not only did they list 3 general categories, they listed an array of countries that potentially could be targeted. Not only the axis of evil, not only many countries in the Middle East, Syria, Yemen, but China over Taiwan. I mean, this is a Pentagon that is explicitly saying that we are ready to use nukes if needed against this group of countries. Finally, all of this feeds into the overall strategic goals, again, that are part of their public documents. The term is called full spectrum dominance. Okay? That is what the Pentagon is aiming at, full spectrum dominance in all military economic affairs to ensure the preeminent position of the United States and to explicitly prevent, not my words, any state or group of states from challenging this dominance at any level, particularly military. Now this is this group who's producing these very important policy statements has the capability of implementing them because this is the Pentagon, this is their job. They have a budget of $400 billion. That budget for military spending is greater than the rest of the world combined. In fact, the increase in the Pentagon's budget of $40 billion this year is greater than any other country's overall military budget. How can this be achieved? There's only one way to achieve what essentially is imperialism. No, I mean, if you want to use a word for it. It is one country deciding that its will be imposed on the rest of the world through primarily military means, because it has the ability to do so, and it will do so with this group of people. To do that, you have to abandon international law. You have to. And Michael will get more into this, but international law does not countenance military aggression all over the world. You're just not allowed to do it. And I'll explain why that came out of World War II. That's what the UN Charter says, that's what human rights says, that's what a whole host of international treaties say. But I think people are probably aware that this government has accelerated a U.S. trend that we call U.S. exceptionalism. It means that we do not have to sign on to any international treaties. Maybe the rest of the world can, or maybe they can't, because actually now we have shifted to a more aggressive posture on international law. We're actually seeking to undermine international treaties, human rights, arms control, ABM, Kyoto environment, et cetera, et cetera. There is a list of treaties, and my organization has done some lobbying at some of the negotiations for these at the International Criminal Court, and it's phenomenal the role that the United States plays, there in particular. They undermined and weakened the court consistently by saying, we're not going to sign unless you remove this, and then they didn't sign anyway. So, okay. What is the end result of this? I think I want to look at the results both abroad and at home. First of all, we've probably seen the CNN maps. We are fighting a war against global terrorism, the Al-Qaeda network. There are 63 or something, over 60 countries with active cells or something, according to Pentagon information, that we can see on CNN all the time. I don't know if you've seen the maps with little dots all over the world that are potential targets now explicitly, because you're a terrorist, you harbor terrorism, it's a broad rubric right now. Who are our allies? Well, we have lots of allies in this war on terrorism, including most or many of the most brutal, repressive, human rights violating regimes in the world. And we just saw recently how Russia, under Putin, is going to deal with what he calls his terrorists, right? Or his civilians, whatever. I mean, that was a message. I think we should be very clear that was a message from the Russian government. Not only this is what we do to Chechnya, and if people follow what happens in Chechnya, it's appalling. But this is how we're going to respond to any threat or challenge. And they can look at what the U.S. response has been. It's very understanding, right? I mean, so this can happen. China can do this with their Muslim insurgency in the West. India and Pakistan now India especially has a great rubric for pursuing the terrorists in Kashmir, even if it means provoking war, as it almost did earlier, and as I have in-laws who are from that region who think that it very well might, around the same time as the war against Iraq. And I think that's something to keep our eyes on, that there are many countries who are our allies who want to deal with their domestic terrorism, whatever, as they define it, as these governments, these repressive governments define it, in a very clear-cut and brutal way around the same time the U.S. is doing something in Iraq. And I think in Israel and Palestine, that's a particularly serious danger as to what's going to happen in that part of the world around the same time. That's what's happening outside. What's happening domestically? I won't get very much into the attack on civil liberties here, other than just to note that it's real. It's happening. And it's happening just 1 year after September 11th, 1 year. And from what I understand from the ACLU, and Michael probably knows this better, that the Patriot Act had the most repressive anti-civil liberties legislation in post-World War II, worse than anything we got under McCarthyism. And McCarthyism, as you remember, was a long, major political phenomenon in this country, and this is what we've gotten after 1 year. And imagine where this could lead if there are more attacks, and most analysts believe there will be more attacks. There already are more attacks as we speak around the world, meaning more attacks against the U.S. and its interests, just like there'll be more attacks by the U.S., Iraq, wherever it's going to be next. So civil liberties are not looking very strong and safe right now, and that situation could easily get worse. Domestically, economically, what's happening? Here, I think it's a too hidden story. I mean, I think people know about this, but it's shocking to me there hasn't been more of a reaction to the fact that this government came into power with an enormous surplus. What are we going to do with this huge budget surplus? What was it? It was something, hundreds of millions of dollars. It has been turned into a huge budget deficit in 1 year. Huge budget deficit. How? Tax breaks for wealthy individuals and corporations. Huge increases in our military security apparatus, this $40 billion increase. And again, most commentators believe, and you could read a good liberal economist, Paul Krugman, in the New York Times all the time. He writes about this stuff all the time. And he's been driven to write that the administration is lying to you. He says that again and again, based on the policies. And so that is happening in a context of recession, in a context where the economy is hurting and many people are hurting. What does that mean when you shrink social programs and social services, expanding your military at a time when the economy is in trouble? It means there's more homelessness, there's more hunger, there are more domestic problems already in this country, and we can anticipate that trend will get worse. And that's, my opinion, is weakening the strength of this country in a big way. The economic assault combined with the civil liberties assault, that is very negative for this country. I don't know who, if one knows the full extent of it and one knows the facts, would really support this as being positive for America, as being something that is good for this country and the people of this country. Okay, very quickly, I think, I'm probably taking too long. Maybe I'll save a little of my kind of speculation about motivations of Al-Qaeda and why we're hearing so many speeches from bin Laden and others about holy war on their end. What is the goal? What is the motivation? All I would say is this. I believe that I believe that the question we were asking for a very short time after September 11th, why is this happening? Why do they hate us? Why, these questions, those are very important questions. And I haven't heard much discussion of those questions lately. We need to really think about those, because if you don't understand the phenomenon, you cannot respond to it effectively. Worst of all, if you are feeding into the phenomenon, and if you're falling into a trap, and maybe you mean to fall into a trap, right? Things are going to end up in the worst possible way. So in other words, you have people calling for holy war against the United States and everything it stands for. And you have a U.S. administration responding with endless war in all these parts of the region. It looks to me like both of these forces are working very effectively together towards something that's not in most of our interests. Why do I think that people in that position might think that this is effective towards their goal? I think of, we heard about asymmetric warfare, which is kind of like the principle of Tai Chi. And that is, you use your opponent's strength. The United States is the greatest military power that has ever existed in the world. run by people who want to use this military power if they can, right? And so it's very easy, actually, I think, for a small group of very dedicated people to have small attacks. There are always vulnerabilities, attacks abroad, attacks here, which they know will lead to responses of militarization and military, especially in the Middle East, war, which I believe in their estimation, that is good for them. They want war in the Middle East. They want war in their region because just like we've heard from the Pentagon that we need regime change in Iraq, in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, these are, again, documents from Richard Perle and his group who are advising the Pentagon, not just Iraq. They think we need regime change in Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. The difference is whose regime is going to win, right? And I think that clearly the United States has the military capability to do what it wants in the short term. But I don't think that region will support U.S. military occupations for very long. I think it's going to create huge divisions, and I think our friendly dictator in Iraq is going to have a very hard time keeping in power. And I think it's definitely going to lead to greater support for Al-Qaeda and these kind of lunatic sects. And a quick word on that level of support, because I have traveled quite a bit to that part of the world. 95% of people in the Arab world are strongly opposed to U.S. policy. Strongly, because they see what happens in Israel and Palestine, they see what happens in Iraq, and they see what happens in their own regimes. The United States has supported anti-democratic regimes throughout the Middle East for a long time. They know that history. They live that history. You can't fool them on that history. We don't know that history. And so it's kind of it's more than an insult, I would say. The excuses we're getting from Rumsfeld as to why do they hate us, because they hate our freedom and they hate our democracy, when in fact, if you go to that part of the world and you talk to people, they want the same freedom and democracy that the U.S. preaches about. But they don't want U.S. policy that explicitly works hand in hand with local dictators to deny them. That's quite self-evident, I think, if one is willing to spend a little time and talk to folks. That's the majority. That's 95%. The majority of these people also do not support bin Laden and his theocratic version of the state because they have to live there. It's like Afghanistan and the Taliban. It's not pleasant to live under the Taliban. And so a lot of people, even though they brought law and order compared to what they had before, didn't like this extremist version of governance. They don't like it. Most people don't. But the problem is, what's the alternative? What the U.S. is offering is to them the worst of the alternatives. So let me just close. Okay. Let me close quickly talking a little about why I think human rights is the best, I don't want to say only, but as far as I've seen, and I would love to be convinced of any other alternative, because we need all the alternatives we can get right now. But I think it's the best alternative. Why is it the best alternative? Well, human rights, without getting into the details of what it means, it's some very simple basic principles, which is equal rights for all people. It's like do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Essentially, it's like the basic Confucian, it's the basic principles of ethics and morality that all religions have, that most moral people have. You know, that the circle of your concern is humanity. That's really what it means, that you don't go into this us versus them. The rhetoric that we're hearing today is, to me, quite mind-boggling. Good versus evil, exterminate the evildoers. Both sides talking about the same language. I went to divinity school and never heard that kind of good versus evil rhetoric. It's very scary to hear it from elected leaders with the mass arsenal of the world at their disposal. So, you know, it's a little bit like the Orwell, we're doing war for peace and justice and freedom. I think people need to question that a little more. So human rights, which is the opposite logic. It is the opposite logic of kind of demonizing a whole other people and assuming they all hate freedom and justifying bombing them. Or the opposite logic of justifying, you know, ramming an airplane into a building full of innocent people because of some higher cause. The logic of human rights is nothing, no higher cause. None justifies killing civilians like that. The reason that came out is because of World War II, in which there were mass killings of civilians all over the place, many Holocausts. And the world didn't want to see that again. I mean, there was not only what the Nazis did, which is unimaginable, what the Japanese did, but what the Allies did with fire bombings in Germany, although we didn't talk about that as much, but that killed hundreds of thousands of people, and atomic bombings. I mean, there was destruction in World War II of a biblical level, where methods of warfare were used that killed every man, woman, child, dog, cat, and worm in the vicinity, in the killing zone. So human rights was to oppose that, to stop that. You know, it's like, again, we're facing the war to end all wars. You know, World War I, the war to end all wars, so we tried the League of Nations. It didn't work. It gave us World War II. So human rights in the Universal Declaration, we don't want that anymore. We don't want anyone telling us, anyone, even if they claim to have a good reason, that for a higher cause, for freedom, for justice, we can disregard international human rights. That's exactly what we're doing today. Exactly. We are entering World War III. We're being told, get ready for World War III, and we have to abandon international law because the enemy is so evil that we have to abandon international law. That, imagine how that looks outside the United States. It does not look good outside the United States. And I think something that Americans need to be aware of. It's a frightening thing for those of us who travel outside the United States, but there is a real anti-Americanism that's growing. And imagine that Europe, which is the part of the world closest to the US ideologically, there's growing anti-Americanism. Imagine that in Germany, Schroeder wins an election essentially running against the American war, even though this guy had a bad economy and should have lost. So that split between this American self-perception and the world's perception is growing, and it's dangerous, and it's going to lead to violence. And that's not something good. And the answer is to return to the human rights notion. Human rights has specific responses to weapons of mass destruction in Iraq that we could be doing. Iraq, we need multilateral responses to Iraq, and instead what the United States did is the Director General of the Chemical Weapons Convention was removed from his office at U.S. insistence because he was an effective administrator, one of the few in the UN, and had ideas of how to bring not just Iraq into compliance, but prevent U.S., German, French, and all these other companies that have been supplying them for 20 years with doing it again. So that's part of it. If you look at Israel-Palestine, again, international human rights gives clear prescriptions as to what should be done. That's what we need to do. The U.S. should be having a do-no-harm policy, not $3 billion for Israel, not $2 billion for Egypt, not support for repressive regimes, and instead just back off, and I think people would do much better. And if we could do active support for human rights, that would be great. I think that's what Americans need to be doing. I think there are a lot of movements all over the world, in which more and more people understand that. I think we're in a better place now than we've been in the last 100 years to actually stop this. I'm not a false optimist. I give, I think, a pretty bleak assessment, and I'm not trying to rally people, yes, freedom is right around the corner, but I do believe that there are more people who are connected with each other through communications, more movements that are based on universality, universal principles. The whole sweatshop movement, the global justice movement that you saw, anti-racism, human rights, civil liberties, all of these recognize their common interests now. They go across borders. You know, hundreds of thousands of people are in the streets already in Europe, and 100,000 or however many. Unfortunately, I couldn't go to D.C. So it's not hopeless, because ultimately, people who want endless war require us. You know, they require us in all ways to support it as soldiers, or just to be quiet. And I think if people do small actions, enough of them, I don't know if we can stop the war in Iraq. I hope we can. I'm not confident. But remember, it's just the first war. There are going to be more. So any organizing and knowledge that you gain now will serve its purpose at some point, I think. So let me end there. Thanks a lot. Sorry for going over time.